the moment the guns fell silent, when the clock struck midnight across Europe on May 8, 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The cannons that had once shaken cities now sat silent in the mud. The air, once thick with the metallic taste of fear, felt strangely light, almost too light for the millions who had forgotten what peace even sounded like. In those first 180 seconds, history held its breath. The radio transmission came first. In London, a BBC announcer's voice trembled through static. "This is London. The German High Command has signed an unconditional surrender." The words rippled like a current through broken homes and hollow streets. For a moment, nobody reacted. The world had lived so long in war that peace felt foreign, untrustworthy, almost fictional. Then, one by one, windows opened. People leaned out, staring into the quiet streets where no sirens wailed, no searchlights combed the clouds, no bombs fell. Across the English countryside, women who had sent sons and husbands to the front covered their mouths and wept into the dawn. In the bunkers of Berlin, soldiers threw down their weapons, staring at each other in disbelief. A war that had begun with blinding arrogance had ended in quiet exhaustion. In Paris, the bells of Notre Dame began to ring, not for the dead this time, but for the living. The chimes carried across the rooftops, across the Seine, reaching the crowds that poured into the streets waving flags, singing the Marseillaise. Strangers kissed, children danced barefoot in puddles left by the last rain. For a city that had known occupation, the sound of freedom was overwhelming. But not all joy came easily. In Warsaw, the silence was eerie. The city, once home to 1.3 million people, was reduced to ruins and ash. Survivors emerged like ghosts from basements, staring at buildings that were no longer there. They didn't cheer. They didn't weep. They simply stood under the gray Polish sky, unsure what to do now that the nightmare was over. For them, victory had come too late. In the Soviet Union, victory was both triumph and tragedy. More than 20 million had died. Entire villages had vanished. Yet, as the news reached Moscow, crowds filled Red Square, singing, crying, waving portraits of those who would never return. Joseph Stalin appeared on the balcony of the Kremlin, his face emotionless. For him, the war's end was not a release. It was the beginning of a new kind of control, a new chapter of power built on the ruins of sacrifice. In America, it was still the night of May 7 when the telegram reached the White House. President Harry Truman, who had taken office only weeks earlier after Roosevelt's death, walked into the press room. He spoke simply, "This is the day we have been waiting for. This is victory." Across the United States, cities erupted. New York's Times Square became a river of humanity. Sailors kissed nurses under confetti rain. Jazz poured out of open bars. For a nation that had sent its youth to die an ocean away, the noise of celebration was a thunder that drowned grief, if only for a night. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the war was not yet over. Japan still fought on, stubborn and wounded. Yet even there, in the corridors of the Imperial Palace, whispers began. If Germany had fallen, could Japan stand alone? The emperor's advisors exchanged silent glances, their faces pale in the candlelight. They knew what the coming months would bring. But in those first 3 minutes, before the world understood the magnitude of what had ended, something profound happened. Humanity felt weightless, suspended between what was and what could be. Imagine the battlefield of Normandy. The sea was calm now, waves washing over rusted helmets and silent guns. Seagulls hovered where men once screamed. The wind carried the faint scent of oil, smoke, and salt, the perfume of both victory and loss. Somewhere near Chan, a British soldier named Thomas Bennett sat on the ruins of a farmhouse, a cigarette trembling in his hand. The message had reached his unit minutes earlier. The war was over. Around him, the surviving men didn't cheer. They just stared at the horizon. One whispered, "So now what?" Thomas didn't answer. He thought of his brother killed in Italy, of the letters his mother never received. Peace couldn't bring them back. He felt no triumph, only emptiness. In Berlin, where the Reichstag smoldered, a young German nurse named Anneliese Schmidt wandered through the wreckage, searching for survivors. The Soviet artillery had stopped, and the city lay in a haze of dust and smoke. When she finally understood that the war had ended, she sat beside the ruins of a bridge and cried, not for Hitler's defeat, but for what her country had become. She thought of her father, a tailor executed for refusing to join the party, and wondered if peace would ever cleanse the shame that now clung to every German name. Far to the east, in a Siberian gulag, prisoners learned the news in whispers. Some smiled faintly, others simply stared at the frozen ground. They knew the war's end wouldn't change their chains. For them, peace was something that happened elsewhere. Those 180 seconds carried more emotion than entire years before them. Around the world, clocks ticked in unison, marking the passage from war into something uncertain. Every second seemed to weigh differently. The first 60 seconds were disbelief. People couldn't trust the silence. The world had been so loud for so long that quiet felt unnatural, even threatening. The next 60 seconds were recognition. Radios confirmed the news, flags were raised, tears fell, prayers whispered. Across continents, people began to understand. They had survived. The final 60 seconds were release. Streets erupted, bells rang, arms embraced. Humanity took its first collective breath of peace. Yet, as the noise of celebration rose, so too did the unspoken question, what now? In the ruins of Dresden, an old violinist walked into the central square, where only the skeleton of the Frauenkirche remained. He lifted his instrument, scarred and missing a string, and began to play. The sound was soft, cracked, but hauntingly beautiful. Passers-by stopped. Soldiers lowered their rifles. For 3 minutes, amid dust and sorrow, the music became a prayer, for the dead, for the living, for forgiveness. In London, the king prepared his radio address. His voice, calm but heavy, spoke to a weary nation. Give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance. Families knelt before small wooden radios, holding each other as if afraid the words might vanish if they let go. Across Scandinavia, prisoners of war were released. In Norway, people tore down Nazi flags and lit bonfires that illuminated fjords, still echoing with the memories of occupation. In Denmark, resistance fighters embraced the returning soldiers. The war had united nations in suffering, and in those few minutes, unity felt possible again. But beneath the joy, shadows lingered. The camps were still being uncovered. In Poland, Allied soldiers stumbled upon Auschwitz and Treblinka, confronting horrors they could hardly comprehend. The liberation of these camps came too late for millions. As news spread, silence fell again. This time, not from disbelief but from shame and grief. In Rome, Pope Pius XI knelt in his private chapel, praying for the souls lost in a war that had torn faith itself. The candlelight flickered on marble walls, echoing the fragility of the peace just born. The first 180 seconds after World War II ended were not defined by victory parades or politics. They were defined by raw, human silence. A silence filled with ghosts and gratitude, with relief and guilt, with hope and fear. It was the sound of civilization trying to remember itself. And though no document could capture it, every survivor carried those 3 minutes inside them forever. The first 3 days of peace, the day after the guns fell silent, the world woke up as if from a long nightmare, one that had lasted 6 endless years. The smoke still rose from the battlefields, the ashes still clung to cities, and the dead still lay where they had fallen. Yet for the first time since 1939, the sun rose over Europe without the echo of gunfire. But peace, as many discovered, was not the same as happiness. In London, streets still glistened with the confetti of victory. The celebrations had lasted all night, men in uniform dancing with strangers, women climbing lampposts waving flags, children shouting VE Day, until their voices cracked. But when morning came, reality returned like a cold wind. The soldiers who would never come home, the ration books that were still empty, the bombed-out buildings that stretched for miles. At Piccadilly Circus, a young woman named Margaret Hale walked past crowds holding newspapers that screamed, "Victory in Europe." Her fiancé had died at Arnhem. She touched the small photograph she kept in her coat pocket, the paper soft and worn from her fingers. Around her, people laughed and kissed, but Margaret couldn't smile. How can peace mean anything? She whispered to herself, if he's not here to see it. The newspapers spoke of rebuilding, of victory, of national pride. But on every street corner, one could see crutches, bandages, and faces hollowed by loss. For Britain, peace had come, but it came carrying ghosts. Across the Channel, France awoke in celebration and confusion. Paris had been free for months, but the memory of occupation still hung in the air like cigarette smoke. On May 9, the Champs-Élysées overflowed with people. French, British, and American flags waved together. Charles de Gaulle appeared on the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville, his uniform immaculate, his voice deep and steady as he declared, "Paris! Paris outraged!" Paris broke him, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. The crowd roared. Yet in the back streets of Montmartre, others were less certain. Some had collaborated, others had resisted. The lines between guilt and survival blurred. Women accused of horizontal collaboration, sleeping with German soldiers, were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved as crowds jeered. The war had ended, but the rage had not. In a small café near the Seine, an old man named Ian Dufour, who had hidden 2 Jewish children in his wine cellar, sat quietly watching the chaos. He lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and murmured, "Why have defeated them, but what will we become now?" Far to the east in Berlin there was no celebration, only rubble. The city was a carcass. Streets were lined with blackened trees and the twisted remains of trams. The smell of smoke mixed with the stench of death. Soviet soldiers patrolled the ruins, their boots crunching over shattered glass and broken bricks. On May 9, in Karlshorst, a final surrender ceremony was signed before Soviet officials, a symbolic gesture that turned May 9 into Victory Day for the USSR. Stalin declared it a holiday of triumph. But beneath the red banners and brass bands, his people were exhausted. In Moscow, crowds flooded Red Square, shouting, "Slava, glory," as fireworks burst above the Kremlin. Yet even as the sky burned with color, many mothers clutched faded photographs of sons who would never come home. For every cheer, there was a tear. In the countryside, the cost of victory was measured not in parades but in silence. Villages had been erased from the map. Fields were littered with bones. In the city of Stalingrad, not a single building stood untouched. The people had won, but they had lost almost everything. A Soviet nurse named Lydia Petrovna, who had carried wounded men from the front lines since 1941, stood in the ruins of a hospital. She had saved hundreds, but she couldn't save her own brother. When the radio announced victory, she felt no triumph, only numbness. "The war is over," she wrote in her diary that night. "But the war inside me is not." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America celebrated in light and sound. On Broadway, ticker tape fell like snow. Jazz bands played Woogie Woogie Boogle Boy until dawn. Factory workers left their shifts and danced in the streets. For many, peace meant prosperity, a return to normal life, to jobs, to family dinners without fear of telegrams marked, "We regret to inform you." But there was a deeper undercurrent in the joy, a quiet awareness that the war had changed everything. The United States had emerged not just victorious, but powerful. Its economy thrived, its cities were untouched, and its army had grown into a global force. In Washington, D.C., President Truman met with his generals. The victory in Europe was only half the story. Japan still fought on. Plans were already being drawn. Plans that would end the war in the Pacific in a way the world had never seen before. But for now, the official message was hope. Truman stood before cameras and said, "We must work for a world of peace." Yet outside, in a quiet house in Kansas City, a mother set a place at the dinner table for her son, who would never return from Okinawa. She smiled as the radio played swing music, and cried when no one was watching. In Italy, the war had left scars both visible and invisible. Mussolini's fascist dream had collapsed into chaos. The people had turned on him, and his body now hung in disgrace in Milan. On May 9, Italian towns began to rebuild. Farmers returned to their fields. Children, thin from years of hunger, watched Allied convoys pass by and waved timidly. But not all was peace. In the north, partisan fighters hunted those who had collaborated with the fascists. Revenge became the new currency of justice. A young partisan named Giovanni Morelli wrote in his journal, "But fought for freedom, but freedom tastes bitter when it is soaked in blood." In Asia, the news of Germany's surrender spread slowly. Allied soldiers in Burma, India, and the Philippines celebrated briefly before turning their eyes eastward. Japan was now the last enemy standing, and though the fighting continued, a strange silence began to creep through the Japanese ranks. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's advisors gathered around a long wooden table. Germany was gone. The empire they had once admired had fallen to ashes. They knew Japan's time was running out. Yet they spoke not of surrender, but of honor. The samurai spirit would not bend easily. A young Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Sato, wrote a final letter to his mother. "They say Germany is defeated. Does that mean our fate is sealed too? If so, I will meet my death with honor. Tell father I fought as a son of Japan." He never saw the atomic dawn that would come months later. Back in Europe, the first days of peace brought not only relief but reckoning. The Allied forces began uncovering the true depth of Nazi horror. When soldiers entered the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, they found emaciated survivors staring blankly at their liberators. American Sergeant William Hayes wrote in a letter home, "I thought I had seen hell in battle. I was wrong. Hell is what we found behind those gates." Photographs began to circulate. The world saw the skeletal bodies, the mass graves, the piles of shoes. The phrase, "never again," was whispered for the first time. Yet even then, many could not comprehend it. For many Germans, the end of the war was not liberation, it was judgment. Families fled west to avoid Soviet occupation. Others hid in cellars, terrified of retribution. The guilt of an entire nation had just begun to surface. The United Nations had not yet been formed, but its seed was already in the air. In those first days, world leaders began to speak of cooperation, of preventing another catastrophe. Yet beneath the optimism, distrust was already brewing. The line between East and West was forming, invisible but deadly. Churchill warned of the Iron Curtain that could soon divide Europe. Stalin, behind his cold eyes, saw not peace but opportunity. The war had ended, but the next conflict was already being born in silence. For the ordinary people, though, the future was simpler. It was about bread, about roofs, about returning home. In those early days, the roads were full of travelers, soldiers returning from the front, refugees searching for families, prisoners of war limping toward villages that no longer existed. In one of the largest migrations in human history, millions crossed Europe on foot. Carts creaked under meager belongings. Mothers carried infants wrapped in rags. Some carried photographs, others just memories. In the wreckage of Munich, a woman named Helga Bauer found her home reduced to rubble. She sat on a broken doorstep and began digging with her bare hands, searching for her mother's wedding ring. "If I can find it," she said to a passing soldier, "then maybe something good still exists." She never found it. In Czechoslovakia, crowds tore down Nazi banners and hoisted the red flag. In Norway, the king returned from exile. In Greece, civil unrest was already brewing. Every nation celebrated peace differently. Some with joy, some with vengeance, some with disbelief. In those first 3 days, the world didn't yet know what it would become. The map would soon be redrawn, empires would dissolve, new alliances would form. But in that fragile moment between destruction and rebirth, people simply wanted to live again. A farmer plowed a field once soaked with blood. A teacher reopened a classroom where the walls still bore shrapnel scars. A widow hung clean sheets on a line, and for the first time in years, the wind smelled of something other than war. The world was healing, unevenly, painfully, beautifully. The war had ended, but peace was still learning how to begin. The first year, the world reborn, the war had ended, but the world had not yet begun. When the last gun fell silent in 1945, the earth itself seemed to pause, unsure what to do with its own silence. The smoke of destruction still hung over continents. Whole cities were reduced to skeletons. Millions wandered roads without homes, names, or nations. And though the world called it peace, it was not peace as anyone had ever known. It was survival. In Europe, the first year after World War II was a year of ghosts. Across Germany, trains began to move again, not with soldiers, but with displaced people. They came from everywhere and nowhere, prisoners freed from camps, children without parents, refugees driven by hunger, and soldiers returning to homes that no longer existed. Every platform was a scene of desperate hope. People held cardboard signs with names of loved ones, praying someone would recognize them. Berlin was a city of ashes. Streets that had once carried parades now led to ruins. The mighty Reichstag stood hollow, its dome shattered, its walls covered in soot. In the rubble, people built shelters out of bricks and doors, cooking thin soup over small fires. The Allies divided Germany into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. What had once been a single nation was now a fractured experiment in occupation. The Western Allies focused on rebuilding democracy. The Soviets focused on control. The seeds of the Cold War were already being planted, hidden beneath the rubble like unexploded bombs. But the war's true horror revealed itself in the months that followed, as soldiers uncovered the full scale of the Holocaust. Film reels, photographs, and testimony poured out from the concentration camps. The world saw the evidence: the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the piles of glasses, shoes, and hair. It was no longer rumor, it was fact. Humanity had done this to itself. In Nuremberg, a tribunal of judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union prepared the Nuremberg trials. 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders were charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, in the crimes of aggression. In the packed courtroom, the accused men stood behind glass, emotionless. When the prosecution displayed films of the camps, even some of the guards looked away. The world was seeing the first attempt at global justice, and the first time, never again, became a vow written in law. The verdicts came months later: 12 men sentenced to death, others to prison. But no verdict could balance the scale of what had been lost. 6 million Jews, millions of civilians, and countless soldiers had vanished into the storm. Humanity had punished its monsters, but it could not yet forgive itself. In the Soviet Union, victory had come at an unimaginable cost. Over 20 million dead, entire generations erased. Yet Stalin presented the war as a triumph of socialism. On May 9, 1946, a massive parade rolled through Red Square. Tanks clattered across the cobblestones. Soldiers carried captured Nazi banners and threw them down before Lenin's tomb. The air was thick with pride and fear. For Stalin, the victory was not just over Hitler, but over doubt. His power became absolute. Those who questioned him disappeared into silence. Behind the parades, famine still gripped parts of the country. Villages that had burned during the war were never rebuilt. But to speak of hunger was treason. To speak of loss was weakness. To the outside world, the Soviet Union looked like a fortress of strength. Inside, it was a graveyard with a flag. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States entered what many called the American century. Factories that had built tanks now built cars and refrigerators. Soldiers returned home to parades and opportunity. The GI Bill offered them education, homes, and futures. Suburbs began to rise from empty land, row by row, like dreams made of concrete. Yet beneath the prosperity there was unease. The atomic bomb had changed everything. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, names that still glowed in the human conscience, had shown a power so absolute it frightened even its creators. In 1946, Albert Einstein wrote, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking. Thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." The world had seen the cost of hate. Now it was seeing the cost of knowledge. The United Nations was born that same year, rising from the ashes of the League of Nations. Delegates from 51 countries met in San Francisco to sign its charter. Their mission was simple: to prevent another world war. But as the speeches ended, the world outside was already dividing into two camps: the West and the East, democracy and communism, freedom and fear. The war had united humanity in struggle. Peace, it seemed, would divide it in ideology. In Japan, the emperor's voice still echoed in the people's memory. That trembling radio broadcast in which he had said, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." It was the first time most citizens had ever heard him speak. Now, the nation faced an occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur. Tokyo lay in ruins, but the Japanese spirit remained unbroken. MacArthur insisted that Japan's rebuilding would begin with democracy. New schools, new laws, new rights. Even the emperor was declared mortal, stripped of divinity. But beneath the surface, grief ran deep. Millions of soldiers never returned. Families mourned quietly. The code of Bushido, honor in death, no longer had meaning in a world ruled by foreign hands. And yet, from this sorrow, something extraordinary began to grow. Japan transformed. In a single generation, it turned from a military empire into an industrial powerhouse. But in 1945 and 1946, that transformation was still just a spark in the ashes. Elsewhere, colonial empires began to crumble. The war had shown millions of people in Asia and Africa that the so-called great powers were not invincible. British and French soldiers had been defeated. Japan had conquered territories from Burma to Indonesia. Now, those same colonies began to dream of freedom. In India, the independence movement gained unstoppable momentum. Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru saw the war's end as their moment. By 1947, the British Empire,